Thank you for joining us. My name is Barry Erickson. I'm Community Engagement Coordinator at Wheaton Public Library. Tonight we are delighted to bring you another art demonstration in partnership with the DuPage Art League. Founded over 60 years ago, the DuPage Art League is dedicated to promoting and encouraging the visual arts through classes, workshops, gallery exhibits, and public programs such as this one. We are grateful to the DuPage Art League for arranging tonight's demonstration by acclaimed artist Mike Kolasinski. Mike is an acclaimed, award-winning artist and nationally recognized pastelist. He is a signature member of the Pastel Society of America, has achieved Master Circle status with the International Association of Pastel Societies, Master Circle member of the Paint America Association, and a co-founding board and master member of the Chicago Pastel Painters. By using the medium of soft pastel to achieve an understanding of the philosophy of nature as a whole and integral entity of ourselves, he is a visual archivist and activist for nature. With that, I'm going to turn the screen over to our guest artist, Mike Kolasinski. Thank you so much for being with us tonight, Mike.
Thank you, Barry. I want to thank you in particular for hosting this and all the emails that went back and forth between us to set this all up. A rather daunting sort of endeavor, and so thank you for that. I also want to thank the DuPage Art League for asking me to do this and being a part of this. This is an extremely worth it program to have for artists in the area. And so I thank them for them, and particularly Sue Thomas, we shared a bunch of emails back and forth to make all this happen. She's behind the camera here. And so thank you very much for this opportunity. Before I get too far, I want to say a little bit about pastels and just a little bit in general about things that everyone that's an artist should sort of keep in mind when they do something like this. There's general aspects to creating art that is common between all the different mediums. Pastel is more of a medium that is a dry medium, of course. It's pure pigment that that is held together in the form of a stick to create just enough binder in it to create it so that it doesn't totally fall apart. Now, if I were to drop this, this would just explode in a number of pieces. So try to be very careful in your handling of these, but generally it's pure pigment. And so I've been attracted to the fact that it's so gratifying that I don't have to wash out brushes. I can leave whatever I'm working on, come back to it the next day, and nothing has changed. Nothing has faded a little bit, or it dries differently, like some of the wet medias have. So it's nice to use this. I started out doing illustration work, and that entailed doing mostly work that was with colored pencils or charcoal or graphite, and all dry medium. So I just continued doing that when I started to do the fine art that I'm doing now, which are mostly landscapes, but in the back you can see that I have a cityscape, which is something new for me, so I tackled that. But basically it's nothing different. It's all about shapes, and it's all about handling the light and pursuing the light and trying to capture that feeling on a two-dimensional surface. So again, going through and talking about different aspects of how I start to think about any image that I'm working on, I initially start by, what am I attracted to? What draws my attention to an image? Whether it's outdoors, whether it's from life, or whether it's from something that I can capture in the camera, and I work from that as a resource. So tonight I'm going to work from photos, and I can show you those photos in a minute, but I want to talk about what connects you to a certain image. What is it that caught your eye? what is the light, the mood, the feeling, the atmosphere, all these different types of terminology that can be used to describe what you're attracted to. If you find something that you're attracted to, it should say something interesting about your subject. Let me give you a little example. If there's something interesting in speech to communicate, one listens. And if there's something inspirational in art, one sees. So anyone viewing or hearing these things, they like to hear something meaningful in a talk, would also like to see something expressive in art. So art is a visual form of communication. And so the next step is, when you see something that you're attracted to, why do you want to paint it? Keep that in mind while you're painting it. What is the reason for you to paint it? Are you talking about a story that you want to say? Anything like that. So this is all about attraction and connection with your image. The next step is light. Very important. We're all chasing light. Without light, we would have nothing. So light falling on a subject defines the object shape. Try to understand that light. How warm is it? What type of day it is? What direction that light is coming from? Is it diffused? Is it overcast? Are there deep shadows? Are there long shadows? Is it late in the day, early in the morning? Understand all of that so that you have an awareness before you attempt your painting. I'm going to start going into materials. Your choice of materials is pretty much up to you as an individual. And what I highly recommend is that as you start doing any kind of art, you become familiar first with your materials. And in pastel, that calls for working on different surfaces, such as back in the day, watercolor paper was used because it had a tooth to it. Printing papers were used, that also had a tooth. But nowadays, last 25 years or so, sanded boards and papers have become somewhat of the norm to use because they can capture and hold on to many layers of pastel. So those boards and papers all come in different grits, just like sandpaper does from the hardware store. So generally the grits are from 240 being the coarsest on up to more finer grits in the 800 range. And there's a range in between all of those. Most people like working on a 320 or 400 grit, right in the middle of all of that. A cheap way, if you're a student just starting out, is to go to the hardware store and pick up sandpaper. But I would recommend picking up something in the 400 to 600 range, because if you go any coarser in that, the pastel just kind of falls off the sandpaper. So I'm going to be working on a board that's from Dakota. It's called Pastel Premier. It's a board, actually. It also comes in paper. So it's already mounted. It comes in this color, what I call rust. It's a very warm brown, reddish color. It's about a 320 grit, so it has a little feel to it to hold the pastels, the layers. It's an 8-ply board. The one behind me as well is also done on that same surface, done with this toned surface. I enjoy this because it gives me a warm feeling overall behind this, and I can then lay a darker dark than the mid-tone here, and I can lay a lighter one. And so as I progress in a few minutes, I'll show you how I attempt to get a value going first off before I even get into any color. Real quick, again, when you're thinking about doing an image, think about what kind of format you're going to use. Obviously, you can see here that I've got a really weird looking format. It's very vertical, very narrow. It's actually 9 by 24. And I take an 18 by 24 Dakota board and I cut it in half the long way. So that gives me my 9 by 24. And it's a custom size. So when you're dealing with custom sizes, those, when you go ahead and frame them, They're usually less expensive because they're standard sizes. This is going to be a custom size, so this framing job on this will be a little bit more expensive. But I'm okay with that because I want to experiment with this. And I've only done a handful of these in this side, either vertical or horizontal. And that leads me into the layout. What are the side, or how do you want to lay out your image? Do you want to use a vertical format, a portrait format, or do you want to use a horizontal or a landscape format? And then the third choice is a square. So that leads us, once you get all of that figured out and how you want to proceed from there, then the next step should be composition. And composition is the arrangement of the painting, the overall picture plane, and how you arrange your elements. And you want to do this in a visually exciting way. So as soon as you start to create diagonals in a painting, to lead your eye around, sort of concentrate on a center of interest, a focal point. And then from there, you can have everything sort of, and you can see in my block out, which only took me about 10 minutes to do, you can see how I've got some of that diagonals pointing into my center of interest, which is right about here, which means that this top third is going to nicely compose itself against the bottom 2/3, where the eye will then lead up into that busy top third. And that's called the rule of thirds. So that's really a nice thing to kind of keep in mind when you're composing. From there, we start to go into shapes. And when you're composing, you just want to lay down simple shapes at the beginning. You want to capture those very large shapes. So you can see what I did here in blocking this in. Here's a triangle here. Here's sort of a half oval here. Here's some rectangles in here. And all of this will eventually develop itself from the large shapes into smaller shapes as I continue to work on this piece. I'll show you for now, I'll give you an idea of what my reference is for this, because that may help. Here, let's see if we can get this in. How's that? Okay, this is right out of the camera. Okay, so you can see where this is eventually going to go. Kind of a typical river scene, just north of Chicago, North Branches of Chicago River. Trees, water, a lot of reflections, which I was attracted to. And so I can play with this and really develop this into a painting. Here's a quick little study that I did. And there you go. Okay, so this one was just a quick study, but I did it in a horizontal format. This is on a 6x9 sheet of sanded paper, UArt, and it's on a 240 grit to give you some of the technical background behind this one. So I had never played with 240. That's about the grittiest they get. So it was fun just laying down some ideas and some colors and seeing where I want to go. And if this is what I want to do in the larger piece, in a more vertical format, where I'm just going to try to capture some of this reflection in sky. Okay. I went ahead and did a black and white in the computer, a grayscale. So you can see that there's four values in this. There's black, there's white, there's a light gray, and then if you look closely enough, there's a darker gray in there. So this kind of gives me a breakdown real quick. My values, how dark do I want to go? How light do I want to go? Things like that. Okay. So once you start getting and blocking in your shapes, then you go from there, and you can divide the image into major shapes like I stated. You can limit those shapes maybe to just a handful. Now I went a little bit beyond that. I initially started with this main shape here, oval shape here, which created a negative shape of the sky. I added a little bit more of some of this in here, and then I've got this reflection that'll carry down eventually. So maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 shapes basically. And then I went a little further and added a few more roadmap items so that I can map this out a little bit and give me an idea where I want to go with it. When you're doing shapes, like I said, think in terms of circles and ovals and simplifying things. And also think about proportion and the relationships these shapes create to each other. Try to keep a variety of shapes, small, medium, large shapes. Eventually, you're going to work within these shapes to create smaller shapes to start to define all of these elements that you have. Also think about the location of these shapes and how they relate to each other. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to head into was going to be values. I'm going to start working on some of the values, and I'll actually start throwing those in. So initially, when you start working,
actually, I'm sorry if I can interrupt for just a second. Could we just get a close-up of the sketch that you've done on the board, so that we really have a chance to take a look at the values are a little bit close, but I think that's better. We can sort of see how it's been sketched out. Thank you so much.
Barry, well, at the beginning of this, there isn't much values in there. It's just pretty much a line drawing right now, just a roadmap, I like to call it, to give me an idea where these shapes are going to be placed on the surface.
Yeah, so, exactly. It was just hard for people to see.
Okay.
The camera wasn't quite able to catch that, but I think we've got a better grasp of it now. Thank you.
Okay, all right, good. I was going to go and start working in values now. And so the way I start out, you can see my board already has a tone to it. It already has this roughly mid-value kind of rust color. So what I can do with this, and what I like to do from my days of illustration, working mostly in black and white, where it gave me a really good feeling for value, is I like to start off with my darks first, and then go from there, and then throw down a few lights. So I'm going to start working in some of the darks, and I've got a new pastel, which is just a little purple, and I choose this as a dark, even though it's not the darkest dark I'm going to use in this. As you can see over here, there's, in the painting that I finished, there's a lot of darks, but it started out the same way, using just this one purple. And for the lights, I generally use, let me grab it here. I generally use an orange. And so with these two colors, I'll create somewhat of a value study. And I do it right on the board instead of doing that ahead of time before I even start this. I do it right on the board, and it gives me my values right off the bat. So, so I'm going to start laying in some darks. There's my, yeah, here. I'm going to start laying in some of my darks. So if you see my reference here, it's one of the darkest darks on this. There's some here, there's some here, and there's some here. Again, I'm not going to talk about actual trees. I'm going to talk about shapes, and I'm going to talk about where the darks are, because I don't want you to get caught up at, oh, those are tons of leaves in there, and I'm going to have to draw every single one of them. I don't want you to do that. So I'm going to just start scribbling in some of the darks and just laying them in with the side of the pastel to get my areas sort of covered. All right, there's a dark there. I can also do this entirely in a fairly dark sort of. In here, you see that the trees recede, the shapes, let me say, recede into the back in here. So I'm going to leave those alone for now. This can be a little bit, and some of this can be turned into a darker shape, sort of like you see in my notan. So you can see some of the darks that are already in here. this shape ends up becoming part of the shadows underneath it that are reflected in the water. So if I were to go ahead and continue that, this whole area in here becomes a dark. And that goes pretty much all the way straight across. There's going to be some darks down in here as well. Some of the shadows and some of the reflections that come across. So I'm not going to be worried too much about really finishing this off too much, so you can get an idea. This is just real quick. Give me some ideas of where I want to go and how this is value-wise is going to come out. So there's a little bit of a tree over here that I might add. So I can take the side of the pastel and do that. There's a couple in here that you already sort of see. Now, you can already see I'm starting to get some darks in. And now I'm going to go and throw some lights in, even though they're not going to be as light as I'd like them to be. So I'm going to throw some in here. This shape up here is part of the sky. And then down here in the reflection in the water. All right, you're already starting to see some darks and lights just with two colors. You're already starting to see a little bit of what's going on. So as usual, this looks like a mess, and that's how it usually looks. But I visually know where I want to go with this. So once you get to this level, I can either start to work more values into this, if I so choose, or I can leave it like this and actually start to introduce color. But I think what I'm going to do is play a little bit more with some of the values, and eventually start to darken some of them, particularly where I want them to be. So that side's going to be really dark. Some of this down here is going to be really dark because this is a reflection of this tree casting across the stream. Eventually I can go and I can light some of this up. It's not going to, some will be darker and some will be lighter as I go along. Get this one. Yeah, this is a little better. So
Mike, when it's a good point for you to pause, let's take another close-up with just the image so far so that we can get a crisp look.
Okay.
When it works for you.
Yeah, I mean, we can almost do that right now just because this is just a quick laydown of two colors. Sometimes I get a little bit more detailed with this part of it, just using two colors. And other times I don't. I don't always get quite as detailed, and I move on by slowly starting to add other colors. I think tonight I'll start adding other colors just to kind of get this along a little bit quicker than I sometimes do. Sometimes when I do winterscapes, I'll do more of a value thing with that. I'll add more value with just two colors, and sometimes I'll introduce a third color just to get so each piece ended up being a little bit different. So all right, I'm gonna stop there for a minute and start to introduce some more darker darks. So if I pick up another pastel, you'll see I'll start to darken this area. And you can see as I start to layer some of these pastels, as Sue, if you want to hold up a little closer, you can see where I did up in the upper corner there. You can start to see where even the surface of my surface is still showing through. So that's an added advantage to work on tone boards. You can let some of that surface show through, or you can cover the whole thing if you want. It's up to you as you work. So I threw some of that down to give you an idea. I'm going to go in here and add, according to my reference, add some in here. Some of that dark going across. Some of that will eventually turn out a little lighter. There's a little dark patch over here that I'm going to play with. There's a little bit. There's not much over there. I think I'm going to leave that, sort of balance it out right now. I'm going to leave that. So let me start working a little bit on some of that sky. Well, first let me try to get a little bit of this back here. These are some of the items that are going to sort of become a little lighter as they fade into the distance, giving you that little bit of aerial perspective. So I'm going to add a little color there and just a very slight, take away some of that red, just a little bit. And eventually this is going to become a little bit darker over here. Again, working with pastels, just like oils, you generally work dark to light. You work more that way, just like you do in oils. Similar. Now, eventually, I'm gonna want to have some light hitting some of this over here. So I'm just gonna quick add a little bit of light in here, maybe a little bit over here, but I'll play with that as I get over into that. So you can start to see where some of that light is hitting. It's coming from our left and going across. So, okay. Let me start adding another color in here. I'm gonna start playing with the sky a little bit. So if I'm gonna have a blue sky, a nice thing to do is to lay that complement underneath. So an orange would work. And so I could change that sky to any color because you see in my reference that the sky is pretty much white because that's what the camera does. It blows out some of that. So I can start to add a little bit of that color in the sky. And I'm still using these hard pastels so that they're not covering up the whole surface. And they're not eating into all that tooth that's available on here. And you notice that I'm more or less letting the pastels blend. Same thing down here. Whatever I put in that sky probably should be reflected in the water as well. So I'm going to do a little bit of that down here as well. Okay. So Mike, there. Yeah.
Can you remind us why you chose the red board to begin with?
I chose it because it's a nice warm color to work underneath. And I can let aspects of that surface show through in eventually in some of the areas. In here, some of that shows through in some of that orange brown area that are in this painting. There's a big chunk of it right there showing on the left side in that truck. So there's a whole, is that okay?
Right.
The whole bit of that background showing. Aspects of it in here as well showing. So I don't have to feel like I need to cover the entire surface. Let me.
Right. And did you say that you're using hard pastels right now?
Okay, there's, yeah. For those who don't understand, these are generally called soft pastels, but within the range of pastels, there's harder and softer versions. Okay, so starting off with these small thin ones, these are fairly hard and they're good to work with when you're sketching or when you're just laying down some color real quick. These other bigger sticks that I have, these are much softer and they have more pigment in them than they do binder. So So that's sort of the difference. They're all called soft pastels as opposed to oil pastels, which have a totally different binder than soft pastels do. Oil pastels have more of they have an oil that binds them and just enough to keep them in stick form. Soft pastels have either clay as a binder or gum arabic as a binder. So there's a couple of ways to work, with the soft ones. So.
Thank you. That's helpful. And someone is asking if you could kind of describe how much pressure you're using right now as you're kind of marking this out.
That's a good question because I like to keep the pressure light so that it doesn't fill the tooth of the board up for the paper that I'm using. So it doesn't fill that up. Once it gets filled, then there's a couple of different approaches you can use to bring back the tooth. Some of it is you could do a light fixative on top. Another approach is you can brush off what you've already done and go back in with fresh pastel. So there's a couple of ways to work that. I try not to get to that point of where I fill the tooth up. I like my students to get to that point so they understand what it feels like. They have something full, and so this is nice to keep a light touch as you're working. Keep it so that there's not a lot of you're grinding the pastel, and plus when you do that, you're keeping it more. You're keeping it. You're using up more pastels is what you're doing too. So.
Can you see that, Mike?
I can see it.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's good.
Okay.
Yeah, that's great to have that reference photo there. And one more question before we let you move right on. Is there a particular focal point that you're seeking to emphasize?
Yeah, eventually it's going to be in this area here. Partly because all my diagonals, which create a lot of energy to a painting, all point to this area here, and I composed it that way. So you can see right now I'm not concerned about any of the detail that's going on here. I'm just doing major laying down major areas, major shapes, and eventually I'll get it to the point where I'll start to lay some of this in, which I'm going to eventually start working up now. So the focal point will probably be up in this area. Having your eye go from the bottom here with the reflection on up into that area, have this line of shapes and trees here pointing into this area. Same thing with this row of the bank, the bushes that are on that. That'll all eventually work its way into it. Like I did here. So you can see how some of that starts to, even though this is a different format, it still has that same feel to where everything's pointing up into this area here. And you can also throw in stronger colors there too. Warm colors are going to advance. Cooler colors are generally going to fade. So you're going to put maybe some of your warmer colors, more detail too go in here. You can see in back here in the trees, they're very soft. A lot of edges that are sort of lost. There's not a lot of definition in that area. So you can see that back there. And so eventually I want to carry that through to here.
Great, thank you so much.
Okay, where do I want to go now? Let me start playing with this dark on the left-hand side. I'll start playing with that a little bit. Well, wait, let me cover some of this area. I'm going to do some of these reflections, somewhat of the colors that are in here. Let me bring in some other colors now. You can see in my reference that I've got this sort of greenish, warm green color. I'm going to lay some of that in real quick. Now, this is a softer pastel than what I've been using, so I want to keep a light touch again. And I'm not so concerned about all those little reflections, those sky holes that you see in the water. I don't care about those. I'm going to eventually add on top of those. It'll be with a lighter color down the road. So right now, I just want to get some of this thrown in there. So let me see, I got a little bit of this. back in here. And again, this necessarily isn't the exact color eventually that I'm gonna want this to be, but I can start getting rid of some of this background that I know that I'm not gonna want all of this reddish brown showing. Okay. So there's a little bit of that green in there. So, and then to add some other fun stuff to this, there's a little bit of light passing through on the through the trees on our left that are off out of our vision, and I'm going to throw some of that in here. There's a little bit back here too. Eventually, I want to get back in here, and I'm going to pass some of this on top of the green that I just laid. And eventually I'll start to sort of blend this together and create okay, there's some of this also on this side. There's a little bit of this going on over here. Some of that sky comes through over there. Throw some of this in. So eventually what happens is this reflection in my photo eventually becomes the shallow part of the river. You can actually see that, and that's only because of where I was standing. The more you look down on something, the more you see through the water and you don't see as much reflection. So that's what started happening in here. So I'm eventually going to work this reflection so it blends into this. So I'm going to add some of this sort of tan color in here, and eventually that's going to take over all the way down. So I'm not as concerned if it's the totally right color now. I'm just sort of blocking some of this in with just shapes.
Mike, do you happen to know the exact names of those colors? Someone is asking.
Okay, the one I got in my hand right now is a Great American Pastel. All right, and it's in a square format. And
the color name?
Oh, the color name of it? Let me get, no, I don't have the sheet in here. I'm gonna say it's more of a sort of a neutral warmish brown color. I don't have the actual number of it, and it doesn't, usually pastels come in numbers. They really don't come in colors necessarily. And a lot of time here, I can bring this and show you this. This is a set of them. So you can see the whole range of colors, and I just got this, so I'm experimenting with them. First time I've tried these pastels, and I really like them. They're really nice. So what I do is I take the label off usually at first, and I crack them in half so that they're easy to work with. Otherwise, this is a fairly big stick to be playing with.
Right.
So
thank you. And I'm sorry, one more time, can you tell me the brand of those? Great American
Pastels. They're a husband and wife team out of Cincinnati, Ohio, that makes them, and they're all made. A lot of them are made by hand. So I just ended up with a set of these, and now experimenting with them. So it's nice to do that. You're just beginning with pastels. Buy small sample sets or a couple of sticks of the pastels, and then experiment with them. See if you like them or not. Each brand has a different feeling, a different texture to their pastels. Some have a little grittier feeling to them. Some have a more creamy, buttery feeling to them. So it depends upon what you like. And I'm always trying to keep a light touch on my painting. So I don't want something that's really too soft at the beginning, because it's going to be hard to go over that if it starts to fill in some of the tooth. Okay. So anyway, you can kind of see where I'm sort of going with this right now. Just laying in really quick shapes to give me some ideas of where I want to go. So eventually I'm gonna start doing some of these softer ones and I'll start to add, you can see this color. This is a soft pastel and I can go right on top and start to lay that in. Okay. So I'm starting to get some of my reflections going. And of course, if that's down there, it should be up in the sky reflecting it. So I'm gonna add a little bit of that in here. Okay. Maybe go with a little darker blue. Just kind of have that fade. Generally, your sky goes from a darker at the beginning down to a lighter towards the horizon. So I'm just gonna eventually work that in where I can get some of that. And I might come back eventually at the end, towards the end, and start to add some of that orange back in there to give it a little bit of funness to it. So I love doing stuff with trees. I'm gonna play with this tree over here in the corner and I can lighten up some of these edges a little bit. And start to play a little bit with some of the shapes without actually drawing individual leaves in. So you can already see that that's starting to have a little bit of a funness to it. I still want to go a little darker up there. Let me try adding some more. Here's a softer version of that purple that I sort of started with, so I can go on top and get some of that. Once I pick up a pastel, it's sort of nice to continue putting it in different parts of the painting, wherever I think I'm going to, so that you have colors floating around all over the work so that your eye is led in different spots. Let me start laying in some of those lighter greens in the background. Actually, let me first start laying in some of those greens. Let's see what I got here. I'll start with this one. That's pretty bright. I can tone this down as I go along. There's going to be a little bit of green over here, some of this that's going to be coming in. I might end up darkening that up a little bit. Like I said, you usually go light over dark, but if you keep a light hand, you can sometimes reverse that and go the other way as well. I'm looking for a nice deeper green. This, of course, is not my whole set of pastels. I have a gazillion more at home. Here we go. Let me try this, see what this looks like. So as you can see, I'm sort of experimenting as I go along. I'm trying colors out, see what I like, what works. You can see I covered up some of that dark that was initially in there. Use more of a, yeah, there we go. Yeah. All right. So now that I got a little bit of somewhat of a greenish tone in there, let me show you, I'm going to start to lighten up some of that background behind it, the trees behind it, the shapes that are going on here. Do I want it that light?
Can I take a,
Yeah, go ahead. I don't know if I want it quite that light yet back there, but I'm eventually gonna. As you go off into the distance using aerial perspective, shapes become less detailed, like I said. They also become bluer because the eye sees it that way. The eye has a tendency, as particles in the air start to take over, as things get into the distance, the eye starts to lose some of those warm colors that are normally there. So things have a tendency to become a little bluer and a little more neutral and less detailed. And that's called aerial perspective. So I want to achieve that. You see a little bit of that in my reference, but I'm going to probably exaggerate that even more so that when these trees that are way in the distance, they'll become almost part of the sky. Very, very similar to what I did here, as you can see back in here. That last row of that last shape back there sort of almost disappears into, and only what separates is a little warmth that's in the sky. So I've got more sky in this one, so I might add a lot more variety into the sky. My sketch has mostly washed out white. You can see a little highlight that's in the reflection of clouds with a little blues in there. You don't see that in the sky here. It's all washed out, and that's what cameras will generally do. So you got to be well aware of that. But let me play with that distance to give you a little idea of some of that. How do I want to do that? I could stay more neutral like this, or I could punch it up and add some more colors, because the light is hitting this section, all this side. The light is hitting this whole section of the image. This is all in shadow because the light's coming from this way, just like the lights here are. So it's kind of nice. So let me choose kind of a bluish green, possibly, might be nice. So here, I'm going to demonstrate taking the label off and cracking a pastel. Some people go, ah, but so do I want that blue back there? Let's see how that ends up looking. So you can see I just experiment. I play with colors, I throw them down, and I say, is that what I want? Yeah, you're seeing that they're starting to kind of recede into the background. So I want to change that blue maybe darker and bluer. What do I got here? Here, which one is this one? This might be too blue. Might be too. So I can add a little bit into here, maybe make that a little darker green eventually. Yeah, let me add a little green to that. So as you can see, I can go back and forth between these shapes and start picking out colors there. All right. Let me play a little bit more with this section up here. So if I want to get a nice, deep, rich dark, I've got a sort of a burgundy stick, and I can add that to a purple and get a nice deeper dark, and I can throw purple on top of this, and then I can come back in this and start to play with defining this whole shape in here. So you're beginning to read that that's, let me put this over here. Let me see, let me throw in some of those greens now. Let me try this again. Now, what I want to do is not draw each individual leaf here. I just want to put in some basic shapes. Just some fun stuff to give you an idea that this is a tree. And of course, I want them to grow. I want them to have this sort of gesture that it's coming down towards into the painting a little bit. Let me add a little bit more in here. Leave that alone. I'll probably throw some sky holes in there eventually. Get that taken care of. All right. What was that one green that I was using? No, that's too bright. Let me. Yeah. I'm going to try to neutralize some of that green a little bit. And I don't know if I want it quite that stark right now, but eventually I'm taking off another label. Some of these, they actually sort of glue onto the pastel, so they're sometimes a little bit harder to get apart. Let me throw that on this side. I'll try this one again. So some of this has got a really nice, bring some of that tan up into this that I was using below to give me more of a, not quite such a green. Okay, let me change this too. This is kind of on the same plane, this tree, as the ones on this side are. All right. Okay.
At some point, could we zoom in and take a closer look at the trees when they're at a point when that would be convenient?
Sure. Okay, let me throw. I'm going to start throwing some high reflections in the water real quick here to give you a little bit of an idea. To make this start looking like water, because it doesn't really have that sense right now that these are reflections. All right, yeah, you can, yeah, go ahead. You can. I'm going to play a little bit more with the sky, I think. But you also notice how I work mostly all around the painting. I don't concentrate too long or very long on one individual aspect of the painting.
And someone's also asking how you do your blending. Do you use your fingers, or how do you prefer to do that?
Okay, blending is always a good point, and let me spend a little time on that. With pastels, what is one of the really nice qualities of a pastel is the fact that these are particles of pigment. And when you put them on a surface, what catches the light are all those little individual particles. And that's what makes pastels have a tendency to have a glowing quality, a luminosity to them. If you take your finger and start to blend them, that knocks down those particles. It doesn't make them as glowing or as vibrant looking. And that could be good to do. You might see something that's a little bit too much in color, and you can blend it with your finger or tap it back, and it'll knock down some of that intensity, a bit of the chroma that's in there when you first lay it down. You'll notice that if I were to blend all this, that would knock all of this down a bit in chroma, intensity of color. Okay, so I don't want to do that yet. So what I'm doing, instead of blending with my fingers, which also adds oil from your fingers into the pastel, and that could be not necessarily wanted. But what I'll do now is, instead, as you watch me do this, I blend pastels by placing layers over and over. So this may end up having a number of layers, like my little study ended up having. 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 layers, depending. And I let the pastels do the blending instead of my fingers or cardboard or packing peanuts. I know people who use packing peanuts sometimes to blend, but on these sanded papers, that ends up tearing some of the fibers from the packing peanuts. And you got to be careful on how you use that. Blending stumps can be used. Again, that might rip up some of the fibers that are in that and leave them into your painting. So generally, I like to recommend that people, artists, pastelists, use their pastels to blend. Let them work in that way. Because the other things can create other problems. And usually beginning students have a tendency to blend with their fingers. And I tell them to go ahead and do it. Try to get it out of their system. Try to get them to start blending with pastels eventually. So does that help?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much.
So let me see where I want to go now. Let me go back into the sky a little bit and play with that. I think I might want to, since the light's coming from our left, I might want to darken up some of this. I'm going to try this blue and see what happens. See if I like it. It's too dark. I don't know. I'll just throw a quick layer down. That might work. Let me, now, if I want to blend this, I can go back in and go over the top of it. Then I start to blend that back in. Still, you can see some of my surface still showing through. I know it's probably a little hard to see it on the camera, but I still got quite a bit of surface showing through. But I'm already starting to get an idea of, I might still play with this sky eventually. I probably won't finish it tonight. If I get too crazy, see what happens when I start to blend? I can cover up some of that. Do you see that? How some of that can be covered up. So. I played a little bit in that upper right-hand corner with a color. But stay there, Sue. See, when I blend it, I can knock down, but see what happens? It sort of deadens the color a little bit. It starts to deaden. I don't like doing that. See, I can kind of, you can see even from back here, I'm standing 10 feet away and I can see that that's kind of dead now. And I started to cover in my background and my surface yet. And I don't know if I want to do that yet. So to fix that, just probably go over and add another layer on top and bring some of that back up. So there. Let me play with this a little bit. And plus, if you start going into other shapes, you can move into these other shapes and create little fun areas of where these trees are coming out, and you can create all kinds of little edges. And I want to keep those edges probably on the soft side. I don't want them to be quite as hard edged, as I'm eventually going to want to get this middle section in here a little more hard edge to it. The eye has a tendency, when it looks at things, the eye has a tendency to pick up things that are detailed and have a hard edge. And the human eye has a tendency to shy away from elements or shapes that have a soft edge to them. Generally, a soft edge to it, or out of focus, or not as much detail. So you have a tendency to look at things that are detailed. So that's why you want to save that sort of for the end on here. You want to kind of start to detail and bring some of that in here. You can see on some of my other images, I've got quite a bit, but there's softer edges in the background on this, back in here. But that's because of the aerial perspective. Maybe bring that closer. Okay. Vanna White's my helper here.
You want me to lower it, raise it? See, that's good.
Yeah, so you can see there's some softer edges back in here. These are a couple figures, but you know, they're just shapes. And then it gets a little bit harder edged in through here. Okay.
Thanks, Vanna.
Thank you, Vanna. Like to buy a vowel. Barry, do you want to go to some of my other images? Do you want to share the screen?
Sure. I'm going to go ahead and remove the spotlight and then screen share the PowerPoint. So you should all be seeing these slides.
Okay, this is Coastal Service. This is 6 by 24. And you can see where some of my soft edges are, particularly in the light that's coming on the left-hand side of the painting. That is done again with many layers of pastel, probably 4 or 5 layers of pastel underneath that very bright highlight that's on the ocean. And that gives you that glow effect. So if you build up colors and build up values from, say, dark to light, you can get that effect. Okay, yeah. Go to the next one. This one's titled March Madness, and it's 16 by 12. Again, the background in my reference, particularly in those trees way in the background, had all kinds of detail in them. And I just totally simplified it and just went with those basic, basically a one shape there, and went into with colors to give you some variation back there. And then I detailed and more of the foreground in this one. This one doesn't have your composition based upon the rule of thirds. This one more has a feeling of that center area is sort of your focal point, that reflection, but it seems to work with all the other elements that are going on in this one. The way part of the reflection sort of take you into that area, some of the edges of the water where it meets the marshier areas, is that a word, marshier? That seems to work. So you got more of a low horizon so that the trees and gives you more of a feeling of height on this one compositionally. You can flip to the next one, Barry. Changing channels, this is one's 18 by 30. Again, off center to the right a little bit of everything. You've got that aerial perspective in the background with the blues, purples going on to create the idea that things are in, in the background where they belong. Reflections, a lot of darks on your right-hand side, or I'm sorry, on your left-hand side. Also cooler colors on your left-hand side, a lot of warmth on your right-hand side. Again, changing from the reference totally, which was mostly greens in this particular one. Next, Barry. This one I just completed. This is the same size as the one I'm working on now, except it's horizontal. And a winter scene, electric blanket, it's 9 by 24. And again, compositionally, you've got the stream coming in on your right, kind of curving you back into the painting. Your eye doesn't fall off on the left because there's a tree there. So all these elements work to make this compositionally a really nice little painting. Also in the background, again, my reference showed a bunch of dark trees, and I changed that to have it a much richer feeling back there, and also more distance, aerial distance in that one. Next, breaking and entering. This one is Lake Michigan, on the other side of the lake, in the state of Michigan. Again, diagonals creating a lot of excitement. Everything is going to your left from your right, but as you can see, that dune in the upper left-hand corner is stopping your eye from going off the page. And then you've got your glorious sunset without the sun. Sun's already gone and down, and you're picking up the highlights that are in this lower right-hand corner of the painting, with the wave actually being in somewhat of a shadow effect. So, yeah. Next one. And one that I've always liked, this is 6 by 24, rock and roll. Rule of thirds, your horizon line is in the upper third. Your rock is in the right-hand side, right-hand third. And everything that you look at wave-wise leads you right to that rock. The sky wasn't quite like that when I initially shot my reference. It was much lighter. So I darkened the sky to give this very ominous look to it. And then that highlighted that wave that's crashing on that rock. And I also embellished that too. It wasn't quite as dramatic of a wave. So don't be a slave to your photos. Make them yours. Is there another one? Is that it?
I think that's it.
Oh, that's it. Okay, so that gives you a quick idea of some of the work that I've done in the past and my little bit of thinking behind them. So I'll go back to this, back to the painting. Let me see, what else do I want to do? I want to play a little bit more. Some of this back up in here. A lot of times when you walk away from a painting and you come back to it, you go, oh yeah, there's something I see that I kind of want to play with. I want to adjust. I want to do this. So you can see I'm not blending with my fingers. I'm blending with the sticks of pastel. And they're starting to get that little bit of, let me try going back in with some orange now. See what happens. See what if I like some of that. Give it a little warmth down here. Take a little bit up into here. Okay, all right, let me quick go to some of these trees here. Some of this on this side. I'm gonna add some of the tree trunks that I see in here. And these don't have to be accurate by any means. You're just adding them in there for diversity, breaking up some of this big shape. Again, making it. I'll probably darken those a little bit. Yeah, I'm gonna add a little more over here. And you can see I'm using the side of the pastel, this edge, and that's how I'm creating these little narrow. I'm gonna darken those a little bit. Where's this? There it is. I can go over this and darken them a little bit. And even if they're not perfect, I can come back later and work around them and work on some of the edges, the trees around them, or the leaves and stuff. So this in here. Okay, there's a nice, where's that one? Yeah, here. So all I can do is just take the edge of the pastel and just touch here and there and create these little colors, just little areas of colors. Now, eventually I'm going to go in and add some sky holes to some of this, and that'll be depending upon what my sky looks like and how dark I want to get into that. But let me adjust some of this back here. I don't like the way this looks. There. It's probably not dark enough. Not dark enough. I'm gonna try something a little darker. Here, let me try this. No, that's purple. Yeah, there we go. A little bit of dark, just a little bit, not quite as dark as I want the other darks. All right, let me play with this a little bit. Sort of like watching paint dry, isn't this? Except this is dry paint. So now I'm going to start to cover some of this a little bit more. Laying layers on. Grab the blue that's up there, and maybe add a little purple up here. So even if you get the same value, I'm adding some purple, which is a purple stick up here, but it's almost close to that blue that I have up there already. So it's creating a little more dramatic effect up in the sky. All right, since I've got some of that green, Some of that green down in here. All right. Sure. Let me play with that a little bit more. Where's that purple? Here it is. Let me play with some of this over here. So you can see I just keep going through and making adjustments on little bits, and I don't know if I want this as dark as the other darks are because it's in the distance, so I'm just going to soften that up a little bit. See, what I can do is just take a pastel and put it over like this, and I can sort of blend all those together and start creating that image of all right, let me play a little. Go ahead. You want to do one? Yeah. So now I think what I want to do is I'm starting to get a little bit of what stepping back. Always step back when you're working. Gives you a nice sense of what you're doing, if you're doing things right the way you want them. I'm going to start playing, I think, a little bit with some of the reflections now to give you a little bit of idea of where some of that should go, because none of this is really close to being finished. This is starting to take effect. You can see some of this surface showing through the little reds. It adds a nice little variety. I'm going to play a little bit more with this eventually, but let me go in here and start adding some of these reflection, or I'm sorry, some of the shadows that are on. And what I want to get to is making these look like they're reflections. Go ahead a little bit more down in here, play around with these, make them look like they're tree branches that are working in the water. There, it's getting to look a little bit like it. Now, what's happening with this little area in here is part of what's light is passing through, starting to pass through the trees. And if I really wanted to, which I probably will do, because I think I did that in my study, is take a warmer pastel and start eating bits and pieces of where that light is starting to come through, to give you an idea what that will turn out looking like. And maybe a little bit in here. And a little bit over here. All right, so that gives you some idea that the light's poking through from the left a little bit. Now let me play a little bit with some of this. I don't want to go too crazy with some of this, but there's going to be a little bit of highlights, a little bit of indication of some of these reflections in there. Let me work on some of this a little more. Get this. find that edge a little bit better. Sometimes if you want to blend too, you can use a harder pastel, like I mentioned, those new pastels, and go over the top of what you already have down. And that'll give you a little more blendability, just laying a harder pastel over the softer ones. Okay, go back in there, play with this a little more. Here it is.
Mike, someone is asking why you chose to add some purple in those darker reflections just a moment ago.
I didn't want them to be, eventually, I don't think I want them to be that dark. Eventually, parts of that will become dark. Reflections sometimes, believe it or not, your shadows have a lot of variety going on them. There's a lot of variances, and it makes it for a richer and more interesting thing. And so I like purple, and I have the tendency to use that a lot. And so I have a tendency to reach for that and start to throw it in, sort of like what I'm doing now. You can see that it's just blending the colors more than anything else. And so I'm just throwing in some of this to maybe knock down some of that red that's behind it. I can always go back and add some of that red back in. I have pastels that are very similar in color to that. So if I need to put any more of that in an area, I can certainly do that. But I'm trying to get a little bit more of this feeling. Let me look at this. More of this feeling of some of the reflections in here. So if I want this to be sort of my center point, or my focal point and my center of interest, I'm going to start to play with that a little bit and start to jack up some of these colors that are in here and keep it a little bit on the soft side. There's a little bit of light coming in there, and there's a little bit of light over here that may be catching part of this. So I can do that, and just already you start to see that it's starting to change and give more definition to some of those bushes that are catching. Now, I'm going to eventually go, and I'll probably use a pretty bright yellow. And I'll probably end up attacking this where it's going to be pretty bright right in here. I might add a little bit of that over here, but not as much. There, I want my center of interest to be more or less right about there. So now, since I've done that there, I need to do that in the water too as well. So to give it that idea that it's being reflected. That one won't be as bright as that. Maybe, is that going to work? Maybe a little bit of this in there. And you can see where there's a little bit of this feeling in here. And there's a little bit of a edge there of probably, probably sand, just a little. Let me fill in that.
Someone's asking, do you generally work from the background to the foreground?
No, I'm working all over. You can see I'm working all over the painting. So, I mean, sometimes I do work from the background forward only because I want to sort of set my light a little bit in the sky, because that's where your light light's coming from, so I may do that, but that's not always the case. So it varies. So I'm getting starting to get a little bit of an edge there to give me, it'll eventually probably become darker in through here. This little, and I'll break it up by any darks that are going up into the. So let's see. How dark do I want this to be? Yeah, I'm very not helping me by doing it that way. Let me try this. Yeah, there we go.
And again, whenever it's convenient, if we can get a nice long focused shot of some of the detail you've just been putting in.
Yeah. Okay. Again, it's not a lot of detail, but it's cool. Yeah. Yeah. But sitting back here now, I'm starting to come together. So now you're starting to see where some of these reflections are to dictate that this is going to be water. So eventually this will all be very soft and not a lot of hard edges. I kind of want to break up this straight line here. So what I'll do with that, as I step back and take a look at it, I'll bring up some of this into the sky. Bring up this shape into the sky a little bit. So let's see, purple. Let me go back to putting in. Let me throw some of this in there. So the purple has a tendency to take on some of that warmth. This particular purple is a warm purple. So you can see some of that going on. Let's see, add some more over here. Let me play with that a little bit. So yeah, I like to work around the painting and continually. I don't know if I like that. Let me try this. Define this tree a little bit more. Let me define some of this background trees a little bit more, the shapes back here. Start to play with those a little bit. Let me get those in a little lighter color. Let's see, what did I have? I had a blue going on there. Blue, green. Now, if I want to get some light back in here, let me get some light back there. Let me try kind of a yellowish green back in here, just to give a little bit of light back in here, hitting some of these, because the light is going to poke through and hit some of that. Now, some of that I may tap and bring back, and I'm going to try. Okay, now I want to change that up a little bit over there. So I can tap some of it and bring it. So if I lay down a big stroke and then I don't like it, I can tap it and bring it back. Bring in some more sky holes kind of thing in there. Let me bring a few in over here as well. See if I can make it work. It doesn't, I'm not sure. That looks too, yeah, I don't like it. I don't like it. Doesn't look real enough. Let me just cover that up. All right. Let me try some of this over here. Got a patch of green in here. Some of this up in here. Lighter.
Mike, there's been a lot of curiosity about those really dark red or rust backing boards that you're using. Do you use those a lot on most of your landscapes or even the seascapes that we saw during the slideshow?
Everything is done on that. Everything. That's how I start out.
So
You
you
use that tone surface. Pardon me, Barry?
So use that same dark red color even when it's like a seascape.
Yeah, everything, even a snow scene.
Wow.
And even with a snow scene, you can see some of that showing through in the snow. So yeah, I use that. I got comfortable using that when I experimented with different colors. I liked working on a tone surface, so I eventually got used to using that. So I just continued to work with this red surface, and I liked it. I think I still want to lighten up that back a little bit. Maybe let me turn it into a greenish color. Let's see where I'm at. Try this. Lighten up that other one back there a little bit. There you go. Setting that back towards the back a little more. I still want to play with that. I don't think I want that sky to be. So most of the time you end up making a lot of adjustments as you work. Do I want this to be quite that intense? I'm not sure. Let me tone it down and see what happens. Maybe give me a little ring of color or a little warmth in there.
Again, there's lots of curiosity about those red boards. Where do you get them?
You can go on dakotapastels.com, and it's a online shopping store that you can pick up all kinds of anything to do with pastels, anything that pastel papers, books, all kinds of stuff. So I want to make that a little larger.
Do you use pencils at all?
I do not use pencils. Pencils are nice to use if you want to get a nice little edge towards the end of a painting, or if you want to get really detailed with them. But I can use the sides of the pastels to create edges when I want to. So eventually I'm going to go in here and add some more, trees and trunks and stuff like that. Okay, now I've got that going. Go back. Not sure how I want to finish this bottom yet. I know some of it is going to be eventually be it's going to be a lot of this water leading you into it. I probably make some more adjustments in here. Some of this might make this a little bit. Use this. So if you grab the wrong color, you can just come back and go on top with the color that you really want. So how much of that do I want to keep in here? So do I want a straight line? I'm not sure I want that either. So I'll eventually start to break this up by going back and forth until I feel comfortable, and that's what I really want to do. But it also has to be a bit of what's going on up here too. It's got to show, it's got to be a fairly representation of what's going on up here. So if I don't have a lot of trees sticking out, but I may eventually have that. I may eventually get to that where I'm going to put some more of this one kind of. That's a nice green. Yeah, so it's starting to slowly take shape, and this is the way I normally work. I play, and I eventually I think I want to lighten that up because that's hitting. Yeah, that's hitting the lights coming through here, poking on this tree, this little shape here. Add some more of that there. Little things like that. I'm not sure I want that to go into that, but that's how I'll cover some of that up. But it's starting to slowly, you want to do a close up, it's starting to slowly take shape. See, when you step back from it, you see little things that you want to change and adjust. I don't like what's going on with this tree up here with the sky, so I think I'm going to add a little more, what do I want? This one here, a little bit more, breaking this up as not being so.
Mike, can you tell us again where the reference photo was taken?
North branch of the Chicago River, north of the city, north of Chicago.
And do you have favorite spots where you like to capture images?
Normally I like to go and catch images or look at areas that most people just walk right on by. You know how many people drive over the street that goes over the river at this point. And so I was on the bicycle path that runs along it, and then I just walked down and did some hiking along it and came up with some of these images. So most of my imagery comes from bicycling, canoeing, kayaking, or cross-country skiing. A lot of my images come from just being outdoors and just finding it. And you're going to ask me next if I do a lot of plein air. I really don't do as much as I should, but I'm usually with a group of people, and not to blame them, but usually you want to sit for a couple of hours and work on a plein air piece. And so I'm usually with a group, and so we're out just enjoying the outdoors. So I'll snap a number of photos. Occasionally I'll do a little sketch, and then work things up from there. So yeah, you're starting to see this come through a little bit. This one blob of shadow that's here. I kind of want to. I don't want that to be such an eye catcher. So as you continue to work on this, and as I continue to work on this, it'll eventually get to the point where I want to balance everything. I wanna keep everything in balance, and I wanna make sure everything's gonna eventually get to that level of the other paintings that you see. But so far, an hour's time or so, or an hour and a half, whatever it's been, I've been able to get a pretty good sense of where I'd like to go with this. And I know there's a few things that I definitely want to adjust. And this is so easy to do when you're using pastels. They're very workable, very adjustable, as long as you don't get really heavy handed and you fill in the tooth. And even if you do that, there's still ways to get around that too. So it's a very versatile medium, and it's so immediate. And I'll take this home and I'll work on it for the next couple of days and eventually bring it up to where I want it to go. So this may look totally different, or not totally, but in some ways look different than what you're seeing now. I may end up adjusting the sky in some way and doing this and doing that to it. But you get a pretty good sense of where some of my beginning steps are working on this tone board, and the value that I did with just the two colors initially at the beginning. Sometimes, particularly in that winter scene that you saw called Electric Blanket, I did a very valued study before I went into but I did it right on this board. And I ended up doing a fairly, with just two colors. And it gave me those purples and oranges that I used in there eventually in the final product. But it gave me a really good sense value-wise where I wanted to lay some of those light holes that were coming through the trees and hitting the snow. So yeah. But this is, for me, this is a pretty good start. Normally I don't work quite as fast as I do here. And I work a little slower. Eventually some of this in here will eventually have more reflections in it and more sky holes that are going to be reflecting what's up in the sky. And I'll throw some sky holes in the trees eventually, and adjust some of this in the back. Play a little bit more with some of this trees on the side. Yeah.
Well, maybe we'll take another long close-up, and there are, of course, several more questions. Do you have like an average of how long your pieces generally take you to complete?
That's always a hard question to answer. The smart aleck answer is it took me all my life to get to this point. So working on painting, that's kind of the smart aleck answer, but I don't want to be that way. So I can, if I have to get a painting done, I can get it done within a couple of days if I really need to. But generally, I don't like working that way. I generally like to spend a lot of time with my work, and I like to look at it. I like to continue to go back and forth with the painting, and because as I'm giving it fresh eyes, even now when I step back while Sue was moving in for close-ups, I saw little things that I wanted to adjust. And so that continues. That's a continuing process that I go through. So working with a painting for a while is gratifying to me. I don't need to get something done in a day and then move on to something else. I'm not that quick. I just don't work that way. And as you can see from my sample work, I can get fairly detailed with it. So I don't want to, take that away. I enjoy that from when I did my illustration work. And I do enjoy still doing that, but I can loosen up and get things pretty quick if I need to, but I'm going to eventually play with this a lot more longer and really develop it the way I want to develop it. It has a decent feeling now, but it's still not where I want it to go. So.
And eventually, do you use a fixative on your pieces?
No, I do not. That's the magic and the wonder and the fun of using these sanded boards and papers. They can handle a lot of pastel. When I'm finished with a piece, it's on a board, so I'll bang it on a table or bang it on the floor. I'll spank the back of it and look to see if anything falls off. And most times there's very, very little, if any, dust that comes off. So what fixative does is to change the pastel from a dry medium to more of a wet medium because you're adding a wet liquid on it. And not only will that change your image, and you have to be very careful when you apply it, it'll darken the darks, it may wash out your highlights, it may fuse. What it does is it fuses the pastels together and it creates a different feeling than what you have, what you wanted and what you intended to have on that for that particular painting. Fixative is also adding a binder. And part of the charm about pastel is they're pure pigment. And if they're archival, they'll last for hundreds and hundreds of years. What breaks down generally in artwork is the binders that are used. Generally, they'll break down. That's why you see cracks and oils from the masters in the 1600s, is because that oil is has been evaporating over the years, and it causes the paint to shrink up and it loses its elasticity on it and it changes it. So I try to avoid that using a fixative. Some artists, some pastelists use it in the first stages to fix something that they've road mapped, that they blocked in. They may do it then. But with these sanded boards, you don't need, and papers, you don't need to do that. I mean, these are really pretty good at holding and handling pastel.
Great. Can you explain maybe what you have in mind for the lower part of the canvas, or the board, what you'll be doing down there to create interest, or not?
Barry, that's a very good question. I'm not sure where I'm going to go yet. I can look at my reference and see that, but I've changed a little bit of that already. So I eventually will probably end up adding as if you see through the water and you see the bottom, because it was very shallow at this point where I was at. And so you see the sanded bottom with the light coming in onto the river. You can see the bottom because it was only ankle deep or so. So I probably try to get that effect with the bottom, but sometimes I let the bottom kind of go off, but I'll probably try to put in some of that look of a sanded floor. And it may take me a little while to get to that effect that I want.
Right. Well, and a couple people have been asking about seeing, you'll be sending us the reference photo and as well as the finished piece to whatever extent that you feel comfortable doing that. And my IT department will add that at the beginning and at the end of the recording so people can take a look at that. So thank you. Again, people are asking about the board again, and that it has the color, you purchase it with the color on it, that rust color. You're not applying that differently. And what's the tooth on that?
It's probably they don't this particular board, they don't really advertise the tooth. They say it's in a range of, so the grit is probably 320 to 400. Now UArt, another brand, they do indicate all their grits, and they've got about 5-6 grits, and it goes from a 240, the coarsest, on up to 800, the finest. Generally people use around the 400. It also comes in other colors, so you can get boards and papers in other colors. If you're new to pastels, I would just recommend, like I said before, go to the hardware store and buy 400 to 600 grit sandpaper and just play with that. It comes in your typical tan. I've seen it in black. I've seen it in purple. So go online, go to Home Depot, Ace, wherever, and just buy some of that. But get a higher grit, because that's going to be a finer grit to it. If you put it on the coarser stuff, the pastel just falls right off. It's great. I've used it with kids, with students when I've done classes with them. So it's been fun. They really enjoy playing around with the sandpaper. And it's cheap. So it's a good way to start off by doing sketches and playing with it and getting an understanding of what sanded papers are going to eventually feel like. Another reason not to blend with your finger, if you're using something that's really coarse, it can start to get a little bloody. You have to be a little careful when you start to blend. So another reason not to necessarily blend with your fingers. I'm not going to dissuade anybody from trying any of these things. In fact, I really encourage you to try blending with fingers, with stumps, with packing peanuts, with anything. Play with all of these materials and find out what's comfortable for you. You're going to see what it does when you blend with fingers. You're going to see what it does when you don't, and you just blend with pastels. I can still keep some of that intensity with color without blending. If I start to blend all this, it's going to take away some of that background of that red, and there's going to be part of that background surface I'm going to let show through. I kind of like a little bit of it in these trees here, the complementary of the green and the red. So I'm going to try to let some of that show through. I might let a little bit up in here, so I'm going to let some of that show through. So.
And someone is asking for suggestions when maybe there's too much pastel on the surface and they've taken up too much of the tooth. How to deal with that problem? Okay,
you can use fixative, but be very careful. Apply it lightly, and it'll give you, and let that dry, and it'll give you some of the tooth back. You can also take a brush and brush some of your area away, and that'll bring the tooth back. It'll take some of those layers of pastel off. You can also try a kneaded eraser and pick some of it off if it's a really small area. Now, I have a student right now that's playing with sanded papers, and they're taking a kneaded eraser and they're using it to take off some of that pastel they applied to add texture. And it's really creating an interesting texture to her paintings now. So then another thing to play with. Pastel has a lot of things you can do to play with. And it's all a matter of just trying and doing it and see how all this comes out.
I've got a couple questions here about finishing. Someone asks, would you put tissue paper and a book on the finished painting and then press the pastels into the board?
No, I've never, I don't, you know, if you spank the back of it and you give it a good jolt, that usually knocks off anything loose. And then you can take a look at it and see if you need to reapply or make some adjustments to certain areas. But generally, no, I wouldn't recommend that. Glassine is usually a surface that you would use, or a paper that you would use to protect the pastel before it gets framed. Once you get it under glass, and I recommend glass, I don't recommend plexiglass because of the static. It can pull dust particles off, particularly if you're shipping to work or lugging it around and jostling it a lot. It may draw off some of the pastel from the surface if you're using plexiglass because there's an electric charge in there. Plus, it just looks, it doesn't look as nice as glass does, especially if you get museum glass or AR glass, anti-reflective glass. That cuts down some of the reflections and it looks really nice. And it doesn't, at times, the way if it's hung properly, it won't even look like there's glass on there. It'll look like an oil if you apply your pastel that way.
Right. And speaking of framing, do you use spacers?
Yeah, I do. I started out using mats. That got to be too time consuming. Then I went to linen wrapped liners and fillets, and that was too expensive. And now I'm just using spacers with a simple frame. Some of it has a gold lip to it. Some of it may have another fillet along the edge of the frame. It depends. But I kind of keep them pretty much all within relatively same look to them. I try to pick up a little bit darker version of the reddish brown, like a mahogany frame. Sometimes I use black. It depends. My gallery calls for black frames with a little gold lip. They like to keep it fairly simple. So, and I do use spacers.
Right.
So I try to get, yeah, go ahead.
And we've been admiring the urbanscape in the background. Is that part of a series? Can you tell us a little bit more about that one?
If you go on my website, you find out that I don't do anything that has human activity or elements in it. I usually do everything so that people can concentrate on reflections and on the environment. So doing a city scene was something a little different for me, and I just thought I'd try it. I saw that image and experienced it downtown Chicago and looking through the buildings and with the L tracks going across, and I said that might make a nice painting someday, and so eventually I worked it up. So I just completed that a few months ago. I'm not going to do too many of those, maybe occasionally, but I usually do strictly landscapes, wildscapes, like I call them.
And just another question about the brand of pastels that you use. I understand that perhaps you have several different kinds. Someone is asking about something called Sennelier, Sennilaer.
Yeah, they're a French brand. They've been around for hundreds of years. They've been around. They're a really good pastel. I find some of it to be a little inconsistent at times, little flecks of harder binder in them. I do have some of those. When you're a pastelist and you get really serious, you end up accumulating a number of different brands, and you end up gravitating towards certain brands that you really like. Whether it's their colors, or it's mostly their consistency, the feel of them, and how it works for the technique that you use. So that's generally how people end up coming across. There's a bunch of different, the Great American ones that I've been using tonight. I just started playing with these and I do like them. But generally I use Unison, which is sort of a mid-soft pastel from England. The Great American comes from Cincinnati, Ohio. Terry Ludwig's, his come from Colorado. And then the new pastels, the harder ones, the very thin ones, are made by Prismacolor. So those mixed in with some Richardson and a couple other brands, Blick, not as many Blick, but a couple other brands, yeah. And you just end up with an assortment of different varieties. And then you have your go-to ones that you usually use. And you find out what those are just by using them. Continue to do that, yeah.
Right. Well, and again, there's been so much interest on in this type of board. Someone's even looking at the Dakota site. Is there a particular brand of this board, or?
There's a number of companies that make boards like this, and go on the Dakota site, hit paper and board, click on that, and it'll take you to the different brands. Click on each of those brands. UArt is one of them. Pastel Premium is another one. Lux Archival is a third one. Art Spectrum is another one. They're made in Australia. So there's boards and papers from all over the world. And the best thing to do is go on Dakota Pastels and get a sample package where they throw in a bunch of different papers from all the different companies, and you can play with them all. And they all have different feelings. They all have a little different touch to them. So that's the best way to really play with and try to find out which ones you really think you might want to use. I did all of that at the beginning 25 years ago. And I came up at the beginning doing my own boards using archival foam board, and rolling on with a 4-inch roller, my color for the background, and adding a pumice to it. And I ended up creating my own boards initially, but now they have boards, they keep coming out with different colors. And so I said, well, they got these. I don't have to go through all of those initial steps. Right. But with foam core, I could cut anything I wanted size-wise initially. So I think the biggest pastel I've ever done was a 40 by 60, and that was the size of a foam board. And so I just took the entire board and did a painting on it, and it was huge. So you can imagine what the framing and what the glass cost on that. It was a commission piece, and they were willing to pay for it. So,
right. Someone is asking, are you self-taught?
In this, I am. I went to art school, but I took up cartooning, illustration, and design. And so mid-90s, when the computer came, early 90s, mid-90s, and the computer became much more prevalent, some of that smaller freelance work that I did in illustration started to dry up. And I ended up turning to fine art. And I spent a lot of time going to galleries, museums, anything that had to do with pastels, anything that had to do with landscapes, I was there. And I took a look at the work, saw how it was priced, saw how it was framed. So in that sense, I'm a bit self-taught. Never took really any classes in pastel painting. Just experimented it all on my own at the beginning, and that's eventually how I got to this level, just by taking a journey myself. I like to look at a lot of publications. If you're just starting out, Pastel Journal, the magazine is the Bible. Go to that, subscribe to it if you're really seriously involved and want to get involved with pastels. That's a good source to go to. And there's a lot of other pastelists out there that are willing to share information, and they have, some of them have books out. So.
Great,
Yeah.
great. And did you ever paint in oil or other medium?
I experiment a little bit with that. Oil is approached the same way as pastels, working from darks to light. Watercolor is the opposite. You're mostly working from lights to darks. You're adding layers of watercolor. And I played with watercolor a little bit, couldn't get the hang of it. So there's another technique that I don't use here in pastel. It's called doing underpaintings with either watercolor or pastel laid down and using alcohol as a wash. Alcohol dries really quick, and you can get an underpainting, and then you can, once that's all dry, you can start painting on top with pastels. That's another technique to work with. And there's a couple of ways to do an underpainting too as well. So I advise you to take some workshops in the area. Look in Chicago Pastel Painters website. You can find a number of members that teach and in different areas of the Chicagoland area. So, and all of them are good teachers, and it's a good way to get your feet wet, even though it's a dry medium.
And someone is asking, do you teach classes?
Yes, I do. I teach up in Highland. I live in the city, but I teach up in Highland Park. In conjunction with another member of our group, the Chicago Pastel Painters. So we split the classes, and I also teach in Oak Park on Wednesday afternoons by myself. I'm the only teacher in that situation. So.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much.
Barry,
Yeah.
let me interrupt just for a second. One of our members, Kathy Newman, who's a good friend of mine, is teaching a workshop here at the DuPage Art League in April 11th and 12th, a Monday and Tuesday. And if you go to your website, go to DuPage Art League, their website, it'll give you more information about Kathy Newman, some of her work. She's incredibly talented, and she does an incredible workshop. She has a number of different ways. Some of them I just touched on. She'll work that way, and she'll do underpaintings, and she'll do things like that. So check her out. She's incredible.
Absolutely. Thank you. Well, and we will be including your website as well as the website for the DuPage Art League in that follow-up email that I'm going to be sending out later tonight. So
Okay.
Folks will have the links to all of those things. Again, just lots of gratitude and, comments about how beautiful the paintings are in the chat. And so thank you so much for doing this for us tonight.
Yeah, if anybody wants to continue this, go on my website, tap into my email me anything, any questions. I'm more than happy to answer. I'm more than happy to share. This is 2 hours. It's hard to touch on everything. It's hard to finish a painting for me anyway in 2 hours. So this you'll eventually get to see finished. And like I said, if you got any questions, tap into my website and Mike Barrett, Kolasinski.com, and Barry, you'll put it up. And you guys can ask me any questions you want.
Absolutely. Well, that's
So
very
thank you.
That's very generous, Mike. Thank you so much. So with that, I think we will say goodnight to everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in. We will get the links and all that important information out to you. And if you are watching the recording of this program later and would like those links, just email me at ce@wheatonlibrary.org. That's CE for community engagement at wheatonlibrary.org, and I'd be happy to send those links to you. So with that, I'll close out the recording and we'll say goodnight. Take care, everyone. Good night.